From the archives of the great library of Arathes, golden city of elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 27. "I can't believe you can talk, and that you skit on me," Fraenk said in a sort of astonished vexation to the bird. The crow blinked its one good eye and bobbed its head in a bird-like nod.
"I was trying to get your attention,"
the crow replied. "That was a nice doublet you ruined," Fraenk muttered and took another long drink.
"Let's talk inside before you get too uncoordinated."
The bird launched into the air with an ungainly series of flaps. It glided low up to the front door of the lighthouse and landed with a set of hops on the front stoop.
"Come on, Neversleep. This is getting annoying."
"What now?" Fraenk grumbled and restowed the bottle in his cloak. He followed the bird to the lighthouse. Once he had unlatched the door and let the creature inside, the crow set out on a sort of methodic, chaos storm of flights across the workshop. He clearly had some kind of goal, but to what end? Fraenk had no idea. His attention was most interested in nearly everything inside this place. It was an absolute trove of gearwork, gizmos, and gadgetry. While the items all had a familiar look, Fraenk recognized almost nothing in the particular function for any one thing. Perusing a shelf, Fraenk reached out to touch an object with a series of brass pipes attached to bottles holding various coloured liquids. He poked it with a finger.
"Don't touch that unless you want to incinerate yourself."
The crow squawked, flapping by with a small vial of green liquid in its claws. It deftly popped open the lid and poured it into a mixture it had been conglomerating in a small cast-iron pot. "Well, incineration isn't on my list of priorities today," Fraenk said, pulling his hand back.
"Fetch us a light for this, would you?"
the bird said, perching on the pothook holding the cauldron over a stack of wood in the fireplace. "Why not?" Fraenk shrugged. "The bird is hungry for a stew, apparently." He reached inside for his knife and flint. He bent at the kindling and was about to scrape sparks into the tinder when the bird pecked his hand. He dropped the flint. "Ow! Skarking bird!" Fraenk rubbed his thumb where the crow had struck him. "I'm trying to do what you asked."
"Not that way. Too slow. Look on the bench. Brass square."
The bird pointed with its beak. "A bird is better at sparking a flame than I am, I guess," Fraenk quipped. He strode to the workbench that the crow had been indicating. An array of tools and devices were scattered everywhere. The crow was apparently quite the scavenger.
"It's right there, Neversleep."
It harked impatiently.
"Hurry, I grow tired of this form."
Fraenk found the item in question. It was a small rectangle of brass with rounded sides and was beautifully etched on its face and back. He could see it was built in two pieces that fit together on the upper third of its height.
"Go on. Open and press the lever."
Fraenk fumbled at it, uncertain what the bird was even referring to. He pushed, twisted, and finally pulled, which popped a section of the brass encasement back on a hinge. Fraenk turned it over.
"Come on now, stop toying around."
When he turned it, the device suddenly fit perfectly in the palm of his hand. Right at his thumb was a metal tab, which seemed to be the lever that the bird was referring to. He pushed it down. A small flame burst forth from an opening near his thumb. It was so surprising that he dropped the device entirely.
"Hells, Neversleep. Be careful with that. It's a very precise construction."
"Sorry, I've never seen a firemaker box before," Fraenk said, picking up the gadget again.
"Oh, yes, that. I call it a kindler, but please, light the fire if you would."
The bird blinked and bobbed. Fraenk aimed the aperture of the device at the wood and pressed the button. Nothing happened.
"Blast it all, you broke it."
"No, I didn't," Fraenk retorted, knowing full well he probably did. "It just needs another—"
"Don't tell me what my own inventions need, sir."
The blackbird shook its ruffled feathers at him. Fraenk pushed the button again and, whoosh! A jet of fire blasted out, igniting the dry wood in the hearth. The crow flapped away to avoid being consumed by the subsequent fireball that burst forth in the flue.
Powers, Neversleep. You always manage to squawk things up.
The crow scolded, hopping from one surface to the next, trailing a thin wisp of smoke from its wings. Well, I beg your pardon. Wizard gadgets are new to me. Here's your apparatus back. Fraenk offered the kindler to the bird, who ruffled its feathers again.
You might as well keep it,
The bird said.
Call it a gift for your help. It's all out of whack anyway.
The old crow then scooped up a wooden spoon in its beak and began to stir the simmering mixture in the iron cauldron. Fraenk found a chair and toyed with his new device. He couldn't make it produce a flame with every press, but it was consistent enough that overall he deemed it still a tremendous boon over scraping sparks from a flint. When the arcane stew had reached a rolling boil, the bird jumped off the pot hook and dug an empty glass jar from a crate full of them.
Pour the solution in here.
The crow instructed, which Fraenk did, curious where this whole intrigue was headed. The contents of the cauldron were thick and syrupy and seemed to pulse softly with a dark red glow. The entire mixture gave off a rank smell that Fraenk had to turn his head to avoid smelling. After it had congealed in the glass jar for a few minutes, the bird hopped up beside it.
Hopefully it's cool enough. Dump a bit of that on me.
Are you sure? Fraenk asked, sceptical. He didn't want a bird's self-demanded scolding on his conscience either.
Go on, before I lose my nerve,
The crow said. It squatted low as Fraenk poured. A fat glob hit the bird in its mid-back, and steam hissed. A rank odour filled the room. The crow gave off a curdling screech. For a moment, Fraenk was worried that the bird had fulfilled an elaborate plan to destroy itself. But soon an odd thing happened. The crow's wings began to shake and its feathers all fell out onto the table, leaving it with thin, pale limbs on either side of its body. Ripples travelled down the length of its obscene, bare pinions as they cracked and jerked. Then tiny sprouts emerged, which became fingers, and then a hand. To his awe, Fraenk saw that the crow's wings had transformed into small, human-like arms, like some living oddity one would find floating in a jar of a travelling minstrel cart of freaks. The crow shook them out and wriggled its fingertips. It seemed pleased by this result.
Yes, this is good,
The bird with human arms said with relief. You can start charging people a couple of coppers just to see you, Fraenk mused. Now unable to fly, the bird stepped over to the edge of the table and looked down.
Set me on the floor, please. Last request.
The crow prompted Fraenk. He did as asked. The bird began to move and gesture its human arms in a way that Fraenk recognized as spellcasting. A swirling energy vortexed around the creature, building in intensity. Then, whoosh! A soft wave of cold blew through the room. In place of the bird, Fraenk found himself staring at a stern-looking naked elf with thick grey hair. Maybe that's enough drink for one day. Fraenk replaced the bottle he had taken out back in his cloak.
Robes. I could use my robes,
The elf said, casting about for clothing. Fraenk tossed him a heavy cloth that had been draped over the back of his chair. The elf wrapped it around himself.
Incredible. You don't know how good it feels to get out of that form.
The elf sighed, stretching his back.
Neversleep, thank you.
You're the wizard who lives in the lighthouse, Fraenk said, awed.
Ex-wizard. I don't do magic anymore, unless I have to.
The elf said.
Call me Valthor.
No family name? Fraenk asked.
They've disowned me 2 centuries ago. Of course, they're all dead now.
Valthor chuckled, then noticed Frank's reaction.
What? I didn't kill them. I just didn't want to be a party with them either. Horrible, the whole lot.
Valthor found a set of dusty robes and slipped them on. He still moved sort of bird-like, as if some vestige of his past form was still attached to him.
Well, I'm sure you'd like a better accounting for the Yin S. Tylerborn, I suppose,
The ex-wizard said, filling a kettle from a copper pipe that somehow produced clear water when he twisted a handle on it. I would indeed. Fraenk kept his voice even, not wanting to divulge his ignorance or stop the elf from revealing something important.
You have to understand that I was unwittingly set as its tutelary. I knew not Lady Horgoth nor her litany of diviners. I was hardly even a token member of the Society of Scholarly Luminaries, and never requested a guardianship of— You have no idea what I'm talking about, do you?
Valthor broke off. No, but keep going, Fraenk shrugged. The ex-wizard sighed.
Assume you know nothing?
Safe assumption, Fraenk confirmed. The ex-wizard lifted the whistling kettle and poured steaming water into cups. Then, taking a nearby pouch, he sprinkled herbs into each.
Give it a minute or two for the flavour to emerge,
he said, handing Fraenk a cup, then sat in a stuffed chair with his own.
The necklace that was until recently in your possession is the In Estileborn, which means circle of intent. I call it the mind thief. Its powers you seem to have discovered on your own. It was quite difficult to piece that human's brain back together, I must say.
He was referring to Joeth, Fraenk realised with a twinge of guilt. That was an accident. Fraenk took a quick sip of the tea. It was surprisingly good.
And you've seen just how dangerous and destructive it can be. It's no plaything. And in the wrong hands, it's completely devastating. As in, it can destroy the city and turn a populace into an unstoppable army of mindless savages who will fight without reason or mercy. Do you get that?
I think so. Frank's cup chattered as he set it down. His mind conjured images of Arathi's population in the throes of a blood-crazed bedlam. That seems like an unfavourable outcome. Fraenk watched Valthor trying to puzzle out what manner of elf would create such a terrible apparatus. He seemed bookish and experienced, which was probably fertile ground for how it came to be. So, how'd you come to own this, Jimmy's tambourine?
In Estileborn, and I was never its owner. In fact, it has a particular aversion to those with magical powers. Hence the avian state you found me in when we met.
The ex-wizard said, rising from his chair.
Biscuits. This calls for biscuits. It's been ages since I've had proper food.
And as he rummaged through jars and boxes on his shelves, Valthor continued his lecture.
The wizardess who created it was named Lady Catherine of Horgoth. Good wizard, famous for hosting lavish parties. I've been to one or two, not really to my taste, but they were certainly creative.
He found a jar with oblong discs of fuzzy green and dark brown in it. Valthor fished one out and crunched it, then spat it on the floor.
Ugh, mouldy.
The ex-wizard continued to spit the pieces to the floor. He laced his fingers together and articulated an odd gesture. The biscuits inside shivered and sucked the fuzzy mould back inside, brightened to a golden brown. A gentle puff of aromatic steam rose off them. He picked the same one up and bit again.
Much better.
He offered the jar to Fraenk, who, deciding it would be rude to refuse, accepted a biscuit and took a small bite. He was pleasantly surprised at how good it tasted.
Where was I? Oh yes, Lady Horgoth. For being one so social, or maybe because of it, she was surprisingly paranoid, always worried about what others thought of her. So she devised the mind thief as a way to peer into others' minds, in order to read their thoughts about her, which is a bad idea. I can tell you that. I don't care how good of a man you are, Neversleep. No one likes you all the time.
Most people don't like me pretty much all the time, Fraenk remarked. He saw that he had finished the biscuit and took another from the jar. When had he eaten last?
Well, finding out her friends didn't always adore her with every thought only fed her fears. Soon she was adding more power into the circle, then adding protections to it, so no one else would wear it or even want to look at it, especially another wizard.
Let me guess. She eventually went completely insane, and she killed all her friends in some fiery gambit of doom. Fraenk set his cup down.
No, she's fine. Lives in a cottage off the coast of Solopolis. Bakes meat pies for the local village.
Wait, really? Fraenk asked. The ex-wizard gave him a sardonic shake of his head. Oh no. I was right about the whole kill all the friends thing.
Took an entire detachment of arcane lords to end her terror, Left a scar on the foothills of the mountain that still smoulders with green ash.
Valthor said.
Then a year later, I get a sealed box with a letter describing where to find the mine thief, as well as a grave warning to never touch it. Suddenly I was set as its guardian, all because I was nice to her at a party before she decided everyone was out to get her.
How'd it get here?
Your Lindblood friend could tell you better than I,
he said.
but I can't touch it without repercussions. When I first discovered you possessed it, I had my reservations about you being its bearer. But I now think you'll do fine.
It'll be safely under guard at the museum, Fraenk said without much conviction.
Anything can be stolen back,
The ex-wizard stated.
I've met Lord Malgrave Fernbrook on several occasions. He's cunning, persistent, and ruthless. Whatever plans he has are not to make the city better. You can't let the necklace fall back into his hands.
What do you suggest?
I just said anything can be stolen back. You heard me, right?
Fraenk stood with a groan and a stretch. He was surprised by how sore he was. That short respite off his feet seemed to let the fatigue back into his body. It was about time to take the healer's advice and get some rest for a while. Thank you for the tea and the fire gizmo, Fraenk said and started towards the door.
Neversleep. What is your plan?
Valthor asked. His voice edged with concern. A hearty breakfast at the estate and then a few dozen hours of rest, then it should be breakfast again. I'll go from there. Fraenk opened the front door.
And the Yenne Estileborn.
Is your responsibility, not mine. You seem like a much more capable handler anyway. I'm just a human with no magic. You're an elf wizard with... Fraenk gestured at the room. Whatever all this is, you'll figure out a way to keep it safe.
I can't touch it, I told you, and Lord Fernbrook will stop at nothing.
Let me ask you something. Fraenk turned back to the elf. You said you're an ex-wizard, yes?
That's right.
Valthor said. Why did you quit? You're obviously good. 2 arcane lords couldn't breach your defense spells on this place. And you're an elf, which means you've had years to study and master your trade. And yet here you are, making lots of things that can incinerate, apparently. Why did you give it up? Tell me that much, at least. The ex-wizard paused and seemed to ruminate for a bit.
You have the right of it, Neversleep. A keen mind, as I expected. I was, as you say, a master of my trade. I spent entire human lifetimes in the study and practice of magic. I'd exhaust the knowledge and skill in one area and go someplace else. But one late evening, as I was turning the final page of an ancient tome, the last volume of a great hidden library, buried for centuries, that I discovered, I saw a footnote. It was a simple footnote, and it referred to a volume of a book I'd never heard of in another undiscovered library. I made the most important revelation that day. The thing about wizardry and magic is that you can reach what you think is the peak and find more mountain still. So I burned the library and buried it under 1,000 feet of rock, then decided I'd try my hand at building gadgets instead.
Fraenk nodded. This case is over the last page of the book. The thieves were caught and the stolen magical item returned. My friend who was killed has already had more justice than many humans get when an elf wrongs them. If I steal that necklace, it just starts everything back up again, and there will be no end to it, and I'm tired.
Fine. Go your way. Ignore the footnote,
the ex-wizard said. He turned to his workbench and began to organize it. The surface was truly in a state of chaos. Valthor seemed immediately frustrated and overwhelmed. Fraenk pulled open the door and was just about to step out.
What about the Fernbrooks, Neversleep?
Valthor called over his shoulder, not looking up.
You may be done, but have they closed the book on this too?
Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Grey Sage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.